Hi, thanks for tuning in today. The question is, how should Greek be pronounced today? That's the subject of our video today. If you don't know me, I'm Stephen Hackett, and on this channel we do all sorts of things related to biblical studies, and one of the things that we nerd out on a little bit is biblical Greek. And so I wanted to discuss what pronunciation schemes should we be using for Greek today. Now there's three main pronunciation systems. There's Erasmian, Reconstructed, and Neohellenic, or what's also called modern pronunciation. Now, when we say modern pronunciation, that might be a little bit misleading. So Erasmian is the primary pronunciation scheme used in university settings and seminaries, at least in America. And this is supposed to trace its way back to Erasmus. So there's actually quite a bit of debate about Erasmus and how he actually pronounced it and how it's pronounced in North America today. The one thing is that virtually no one is arguing that Erasmian pronunciation is the correct pronunciation in terms of history, like people were pronouncing it that way in Jesus' day. Erasmian pronunciation is demonstrably not the correct pronunciation in terms of how they pronounced it historically. But it's been thought to be helpful pedagogically in regards to distinguishing, for example, the difference between omega and omicron or something like that. So people think of it as maybe an Americanized version of Greek pronunciation, and it's easier for North Americans to get their tongue around maybe. The main advantage to Erasmian pronunciation is just that a lot of academics use it. It's used very widely in seminaries, so it has that advantage. The second one we can discuss is Reconstructed pronunciation. Now, Reconstructed pronunciation, I don't know who originally kind of spearheaded this, but one of the names that became very, very popular with it was Randall Booth. So Randall Booth had a living language approach, and he taught people how to use a pronunciation that he thought was closer to how the Greek would have been pronounced in Jesus' day. More recently, though, a book has come out by Benjamin Cantor, which we'll be discussing in this video in more depth. This is just the short one. He's got a book of about, I think it's like 900 pages, where he goes into a lot of depth, and he's changed some of the pronunciation of Randall Booth and made some modifications. So I think the gold standard right now for Reconstructed pronunciation would be Benjamin Cantor's work. The third pronunciation is Neohellenic, or modern pronunciation. But this is really a misnomer. So you would think that because the Greek that's spoken today in Athens is so far separated from the Greek that was spoken 2,000 years ago in Athens, that the pronunciation would be wildly different. That's what I thought. Well, there's been some work that's been done, some serious scholarship by a number of scholars, but the one I want to highlight for you today is Dr. Zachariou, and he has gone through and gone letter by letter and done the historical research, and I think he is correct when he says that we should no longer call modern pronunciation, we should call it historical pronunciation. He goes back and shows that so many of these letters were pronounced almost identically in Jesus' day as they're pronounced now. Now, if you don't believe me on that, Dr. Cantor, who I just mentioned, has done a massive work on this as well. I'm going to leave links for both of these books. Sometimes you can find some really good deals on Kindle. The other day, I don't know if it's still priced this way now, but the other day, Dr. Zachariou's book was only $2.99 on Kindle. But he's done incredible research going into how Greek was pronounced. But who I'm also calling to the witness stand on this is Dr. Cantor himself, who has just written a 900-page book about how Greek was pronounced historically. And what I'm shocked by is even on Dr. Cantor's Reconstructed pronunciation, how close, let's say Dr. Cantor got everything right. It's amazing to me how close the pronunciation that's spoken today in Athens was to the Greek that Paul would have been speaking in terms of how it was pronounced. Now, there are some differences between modern pronunciation, what's called modern pronunciation. I'm going to just for simplicity, keep calling it modern pronunciation, although I do agree we should call it historical pronunciation, and Reconstructed. There are differences. And so if you're trying to pronounce Greek in a way that is correct and not just an academic made-up pronunciation, then you're going to either need to go with a modern pronunciation, or you're going to need to go with Dr. Cantor's Reconstructed pronunciation. Today, I want to make a case for you that we should be using modern pronunciation for Koine Greek, rather than Reconstructed pronunciation. Now, there are arguments for Erasmian pronunciation, and that's mostly convention. It's just ease of use for academics talking to one another. But if you want to do something that's serious, that's grounded in history, and want to have an actual authentic pronunciation for Greek, you need to either go with modern or Reconstructed. And I'm going to make the case right now that I think we should go with modern over Reconstructed. Now, I am instructor at Biblical Mastery Academy, and currently I've been using Erasmian pronunciation for when I help students through their Greek, because that's what they're learning. So I'm not like a purist on this. Like I think anybody ought to go to war over pronunciation or anything like that. And in the grand scheme of things, if you're not using the language as a living language, then it probably doesn't matter that much. But one of the things we have been considering at Biblical Mastery Academy is whether we might switch over to like a Reconstructed pronunciation, and I'm happy to do that if that's the way Dr. Darrell Burling and some of the others decide to go. Happy to go that way, but I wanted to make a case for modern pronunciation over Reconstructed. So here's my case. This is how I'm teaching Greek to my children. I'm trying to teach them with modern pronunciation because here's my reasons. Let's get right into it. Number one. Again, going back to this, it is historical. Almost all of the sounds, if not all of the sounds that are now being used in Athens, where modern Greek speakers are speaking Greek, those sounds go way back, centuries. This is the burden of what Dr. Zachariou has done in his book. He has shown that these go way back. And how you can demonstrate this is by spelling variations, spelling changes. And so, yes, it is historical. It's remarkable to me how close the pronunciation actually is. So it's historical. That's my first point. Number two, it's practical. There are millions of Greek-speaking people in the world today. None of those Greek-speaking people, virtually none of those Greek-speaking people, outside of Dr. Cantor and some of the ones that are following him, and a few that have followed Randall Booth, are using anything other than modern pronunciation or historical pronunciation. It's practical because there's so many speakers who are actually using that pronunciation. They're using it in liturgical settings, in their churches, when they're reading the Greek text. They're using modern pronunciation. When Greek speakers study ancient Greek and they study Koine Greek, they're using modern pronunciation. It's practical as well as historical. Now, the other thing I will say is what a lot of people don't realize is that modern Greek and Koine Greek are so close to, you would think, again, there's 2,000 years between them. Not only are they pronounced in a very, very similar way, also, you can take modern Greek and compare it to Koine Greek and realize that not a lot of changes, relatively speaking, have taken place in the languages. I've been using Duolingo to start working on learning modern Greek, and there are sentences in modern Greek that are easy for me to translate because I've studied Koine Greek extensively. There's not this vast difference between the two. In fact, I would suggest that the difference between Koine Greek and modern Greek would be something analogous to us reading Shakespeare today and modern English. You might technically say that Shakespearean English is dead, but I mean, a modern speaker can read Shakespeare and understand something. There's some words that he doesn't understand that he has to look up, etc., etc. But there's modern Greek in Kini Greek are not that far apart. So that's another reason why I think that we should use modern pronunciation. Now, this would be analogous. Now, let's say somebody in France wanted to start learning to read Shakespeare. That's the main thing he wanted to do, was just learn how to read Shakespeare. Would we tell that person, oh, well, learn Reconstructed English, a Reconstructed pronunciation to learn how to read Shakespeare? Ironically, I was doing a little research. There's people who actually do that. There's like a Reconstructed pronunciation for Shakespeare. But honestly, if you were a French-speaking person, wouldn't you just want to learn how people pronounce English right now? Isn't it close enough? Because how practical it would be, because you could go on and learn Shakespearean English and go on and learn modern English. So I think there's a bit of a disconnect there. If we treated it like anything else, I don't think we would feel like we need to come up with something that's made up, a reconstructed pronunciation in order to read Kini Greek. Also, I would say that modern pronunciation is stable. I told you that Randall Booth did a lot of research to try to figure out how to reconstruct Kini Greek. Well, if you learned Randall Booth's pronunciation, you're going to have to change some things now that Benjamin Cantor's come along. Benjamin Cantor's made some improvements and changes from how Randall Booth suggested the language should be pronounced. And so who's to say that 20 years from now there won't be some more improvements that are made? Now, I want to just hasten to say that I think Dr. Cantor's probably done a marvelous job. And by the way, I think he's done a great service to the church. For those who are dealing with textual criticism, it would be nice to know exactly, right to the detail, how it was pronounced. But the reality is there are no tape recorders in the ancient world. None at all. So we're basically relying on these spelling variations to try. Both Dr. Zachariou and Dr. Cantor are relying on spelling variations to try to reconstruct how Greek might have been pronounced at that time. We just didn't have a tape recorder. So who's to say that Dr. Cantor's exactly right? And I'm going to say that I feel confident that he's probably gotten pretty close, as much research that he's done. But I just don't think it's worth a reconstructed pronunciation when we have a good, solid, modern pronunciation that goes historically back, in most of the cases, all the way back to the apostles. So let me just give you one example. So Dr. Cantor recommends pronouncing the Greek letter eta or ita, kind of like the end of how we say, in English, we say the word hey, H-E-Y, right? Hey. He says you kind of pronounce it like that, kind of without the Y on the end. So it's kind of an sound, something like that. But then if you explore Dr. Zachariou's work and look at his, he can show you that hundreds of years before Christ, they were already exchanging ita or eta with iota. And so so there's evidence that goes all the way back, hundreds of years before Christ, that some people were pronouncing the eta or ita with the same sound that modern speakers do today. And this is interesting because Dr. Cantor himself recognizes this. And he says the vowel eta, or eta, however you want to pronounce it, had already merged with e, that is iota, and epsilon iota, and was pronounced as a front-closed, unrounded vowel. And then he gives the IPA symbol there. This is its pronunciation in modern Greek. Thus, if one wants greater similarity between their pronunciation and that of modern Greek, it is acceptable historically in some regional varieties to pronounce eta or ita as e, just like they do in modern Greece, because he realizes that there's evidence that people in Jesus' day around the Mediterranean world were pronouncing it exactly like modern speakers do. And my question is, why would we want to pronounce it differently than modern speakers do if people in Jesus' day, in other words, if Paul's writing a letter to a city in Galatia or wherever, and they're pronouncing it exactly like modern speakers do, why would we want to change that? So again, I think the reconstructed pronunciation is good on an academic level, but here's the thing. How many people actually use reconstructed pronunciation? I think that Dr. Cantor has a long climb on his hand if he thinks he's going to get these seminaries to change from Erasmian pronunciation. I think the trajectory is just not there. I don't think the momentum's there to go to this pronunciation. So why would we want to go to pronunciation that's used by very, very few people, which is questionable because it's been reconstructed, and there's some examples in it where it's moved away from a modern pronunciation to a pronunciation that was used possibly in Judea, Palestine, but the modern pronunciation was already being used in other parts of the Mediterranean. To me, it doesn't make any sense to change away from the modern pronunciation when we have evidence that people were using that same, making those same sounds with some of those same letters at the very time the apostles were writing. I don't know why we would make that kind of effort. So you have millions of people in Greek-speaking countries, millions of them actually using this modern pronunciation or historical pronunciation. You have thousands of people using Erasmian pronunciation in seminaries, but very, very few people using reconstructed pronunciation. It just makes sense to me that we would go with a modern pronunciation. The thing about it is, with modern pronunciation, you actually have people who know the language, know Greek, speak Greek, and while I can go through this book and I can compare the sounds that he's made in the IPA and kind of compare the chart and pick my way through it and kind of learn what he's saying, that the exact way to pronounce it is, there's not very many practitioners of this pronunciation. Whereas I can use modern pronunciation, which, as even Dr. Cantor recognizes, even some of his variations were being used in the time of Jesus. I can use modern pronunciation, and there are millions of practitioners. I could get live feedback on my pronunciation when I'm using a pronunciation that's actually used by millions of people that has a strong historical pedigree. That all being said, should my good friend and mentor, one that I look up to, Dr. Daryl Burling, switch over to Dr. Cantor's pronunciation, which, by the way, is probably a great improvement from Erasmian, I'll be happy to switch with him for class purposes. But I'm making a pitch and appeal here. I think that there's a strong historical argument to be made for modern pronunciation, and I think it's much more practical. And so that's my case for modern pronunciation.